Welcome to Full Frame. In this episode, I want to talk about light. When we think of photography, it's all about controlling light. And as we look at that, we have various tools or techniques that we can use to control light as it gets to the sensor. You have, for example, the shutter speed. You have the ISO. You have the aperture. You have a grid where you can add stops of light. I want to give you a brief understanding of what they mean and how you can use them effectively to control light. If we think about specialty events, weddings, etc., the ability to control light is essential. And I talk a lot of time about getting a lens, for example, with an f-stop of 2.8. If I get a lens that has an f-stop of 4 and I go from a 4 to a 2.8, I double the amount of light that I can allow through that lens. So I want you to grasp what I'm saying. And getting a lens that has a maximum f-stop or aperture opening of 4, and then opening it to 4, and then having another camera with a lens that has a maximum opening of 2.8 and opening it to 2.8, the amount of light getting to the sensor with everything else being the same on the one with 2.8 is going to be double the amount on the 4. So by changing the aperture, we can control the amount of light, and every change in a full stop either adds or takes away a stop of light, or we want to look at a bucket of light. So we want to get as much light as possible to the sensor, but at the same time you want to control it because you want your exposure within a certain window. If you overexpose, what happens is that the light in that pixel begins to bleed into the surrounding pixels and bloom, and the data then is lost and cannot be recovered. If you underexpose, then the dark areas, if you try to brighten them, you're going to find a lot of distortion and weird coloration. So you want to get a picture that you have within a certain window of exposure so that you can either brighten it or darken it and not see a distortion or loss of data. So you want to control light either by ISO, and now I want to look at ISO. If I go from an ISO 100 to an ISO of 200, I double the amount of light. So every increase, every full stop increase in ISO, I double the amount of light. What's the negative on that? Well, as you're going to see, there's always a compromise. And we compromise resolution versus sensitivity. So when I look at ISO, I want an ISO that allows enough light on the sensor without losing resolution, which is the ability to separate cleanly each detail. If you've ever photographed a sports event, for example a football event at nighttime, and you can't use flash, and you're using a high ISO and you take a picture, you will see what I mean, that you start to lose that high resolution. And sometimes you can gain it back by cropping the picture and compressing it. But as you increase ISO, you start to gain more noise, more pixel detail, but you lose that resolution, that sensitivity. When I'm taking stock pictures that I want to sell, I like an ISO as low as possible, 100, 160, or 200. I find they give phenomenal resolution, and based on the fact that I have as much light as I want through flash, I have the sensitivity I need. Now I can get the resolution I want. But when we get into situations like specialty events or weddings where the light starts to become a problem, I've got to find a way to get as much light in without sacrificing the resolution. When I buy a camera, I encourage you to look at studies of how the camera performs at an ISO of about 6400. I find 6400 is about my limit, okay? If you can get good clean images at 6400, then I consider that a good camera. Today they're starting to go to 12,800, and that's even better. But I typically want at least a good high quality image at an ISO of 6400. So I can control the amount of light getting through by changing the ISO. So as I increase ISO, I increase the amount of light or the buckets of light. If I take that aperture, the f-stop, and I decrease the f-stop, which opens up the aperture, so the aperture gets bigger. I hope you understand that when we talk about f, so we go from an f4 to an f2.8, the actual opening of the lens doubles, it increases, okay? So even though the f number has dropped, the actual aperture size has increased. It's bigger. And so more light gets through. So if, for example, I want an image with maximum depth of field and as much in focus, then I want a f-stop that is extremely high so that I have almost a pinhole opening of the aperture, so about a 20-22. But I get very little light in. If I'm in a low light situation like a wedding or a specialty event, I want as much light as possible, and that's why I want a lens where I can go to about a 2.8, so I get as much light in as possible. The other thing I can control is shutter speed. If I go from a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second to 1/200th of a second, so I have doubled the speed, I half the amount of light. So the amount of light that I get at 1/200th of a second compared to 1/100th of a second is half the amount. So you can control light by changing the ISO, you can control light by changing the aperture, and you can control light by changing the shutter speed. In terms of shutter speed, when I use flash, I try to keep that shutter speed around 1/80, 1/100, because if you set it too high, you lose ambient light, and I want as much ambient light as possible. If I set it too slow, then I start to see blur, and I see that double exposure that I don't want. So in a low light situation, I want to control the main parameters, which are going to be my aperture, my shutter speed, and my ISO. If I can control them, that leaves one thing left, which is the grid. Okay? So when I go into a low light situation, I typically switch to manual and I set my ISO, if I'm using flash, to ISO 1600, maybe 3200 if I want a little more light. I set my f-stop to 2.8, so it's as big as possible. I set my shutter speed to about 1/100th of a second. And now all I need to change is the grid. And as you'll see, I showed a picture of the grid. You have the ability to add either stops of light or remove stops of light. So each stop of light is like, again, changing that f-stop from 4 to 2.8. I'm increasing the amount of light, or I'm decreasing it. So if my image is too bright, I then can take a stop of light off, or I can add a stop of light. So it's less variables that I need to control. And when I'm shooting a wedding or a specialty event, I don't have a lot of time to move, play around, so I want as much flexibility. I want few variables to change. And as I said, by doing this, I find this very, very effective. Now, if, again, my general rules, of course, is that if you are shooting with flash, ISO 1/1600. If it's a little dark and you want a lot more ambient light, go up to 3200. If you're shooting without a flash, you're going to need to go to about 6400. If there's other sources of light, then you can decrease that to ISO 3200. But again, you're going to have to watch. That's where it becomes more challenging, is when you don't have additional flash. You really need a lens of a 2.8 so that you can get as much light in as possible. I hope that helps. And again, if you think of things in terms of buckets of light and controlling it, if you want to increase the amount of light, you can what? You can up the ISO. But again, be careful. If you up the ISO too much, you compromise sensitivity, resolution. You can change the aperture. I can decrease the size of the f-stop, increase the aperture, but remember the compromise with that. If the f-stop gets lower, the amount, the depth of field, the amount that is actually in focus gets smaller. So you have a very shallow depth of field as that f-stop gets lower. The other thing you can do is change the shutter speed. Remember this, that if I decrease that shutter speed, there's only a certain point I can go to before I start to see shake and hand blur. So you can only go so far, but if you can control them and get them to a compromise and then change the grid, hopefully you can creatively capture the images you are looking for. I hope this has helped, and until next time, keep shooting.